Imagine a single empire stretching from the iron shores of the Pacific to the trembling heart of Eastern Europe, bound by one law and terrorized by one name, Karakorum. Möngke Khan, the fourth and final great Khan of a unified Mongol world, was the last man alive with the iron will to hold this magnificent, monstrous machine together under a single vanguard. His face bore the weight of conquered continents, and within those narrow, calculating eyes lived a terrible knowledge, awareness of precisely how much empire one bloodline could hold before it shattered. In the summer of 1259, before the walls of a minor Chinese city called Heizhou, Möngke Khan collapsed, struck by dysentery, some claimed, by an arrow's shadow, said others, and surrendered to the abyss. In that single moment of extinguishing breath, something the Mongols had never learned to value was destroyed forever. The hand that gripped the fraying rope had gone slack, and the silence that followed was catastrophic. The empire that Genghis Khan had forged from the dust and iron and blood of annihilated civilizations was, in its truest architecture, a monument balanced on the singular, irreplaceable weight of one supreme commander. As Möngke drew his final breath, dust began rising along the empire's distant frontiers, not the dust of armies marching toward some foreign enemy, but hoofbeats turning inward toward the very throne itself. Here is the supreme and merciless irony that history delights in repeating. The nation whose fire no external sword had extinguished across an entire century would be ignited from within the war tent itself. Möngke's death was not merely the passing of one warlord, it was the collapse of an unwritten covenant, the doctrine that Mongol blood was sacred and unified, and the enemy was always beyond the perimeter. Thousands of miles from those Chinese walls, two princes who shared the same ancestral bloodline were already reaching slowly for their sword hilts, their common veins binding them as a single jewel divided them, the throne of the world. Kublai, the scholar prince, steeped in Chinese philosophy and the labyrinthine sophistication of Han civilization, stood in the east, believing that the new world order would be constructed from books, not lances. Ariq Böke, the pure-blooded son of the open steppe, in whose veins ran the wild intoxication of wind and hunt and savage freedom, believed that any Mongol who abandoned his horse for a Chinese throne had already died without honor. The Kurultai, that grand assembly of Mongol princes ordained by ancestral doctrine to choose the next great Khan by sacred consensus, was never convened, because Kublai understood that consensus would not favor him. Instead, Kublai made the one move that could not be undone. He declared himself Great Khan by unilateral proclamation, anchoring his claim not in tradition, but in the sheer iron mass of his armies across Chinese soil. Ariq Böke erupted like a desert storm caged against a mountain face, rallying the tribal purists around his banner and proclaiming his own Khanate, leaving the world to stare in disbelief at two supreme rulers demanding one throne. 4 devastating years of fratricidal war, from 1260 to 1264, and in every blood-soaked engagement, the Mongol blood that Genghis Khan had spent a lifetime unifying was poured back into the dust of its own origin. Both armies fought with identical tactics, identical weapons, identical feigned retreats and encircling hammer strikes, sons of the same doctrine, applying against each other the very principles of annihilation designed for foreign enemies. In the end, Ariq Böke did not break for lack of courage. He broke because Kublai controlled the great agricultural plains of China, and in that particular war, famine proved a more decisive weapon than any cavalry charge. Ariq Böke surrendered in 1264, brought before his brother in chains, and in that moment of supreme degradation, the steppe prince stared into Kublai's eyes and asked, "In this war, was it you or I who stood on the right side?" Kublai gave no answer. Ariq Böke died 2 years later in captivity, under circumstances that history records with deliberate vagueness, whether natural death or orchestrated silence for a question that was itself an indictment. No chronicler dares confirm. Yet Kublai's victory over his brother was hollow from its first breath. The blood of that fraternal war had not yet dried, and in the distant borderlands, every surviving prince was cataloging everything with the long and patient memory of the wronged. Among them was Kaidu, grandson of Ogedei, who saw in Kublai's self-coronation a desecration of Mongol law's deepest spirit, and resolved that his entire existence would become a battle to prove that the doctrine of the ancestors could not be dishonored. From the iron heart of Central Asia, Kaidu ignited a war against Kublai that would burn without mercy or truce for 4 full decades, a war in which the empire's armies consumed their own strength instead of spending it upon their enemies. 40 years of relentless warfare across Central Asia, the territory that should have been the great imperial artery connecting east to west, transformed instead into an arena of mutual annihilation, devouring resources, fracturing trade routes, and dissolving the bonds of common destiny. That Kaidu died undefeated in 1301 confirms the darkest truth. The Mongol sword that the armies of Islam, Christendom, and the great civilizations of the East had failed to turn was finally blunted by cousins alone. The Mongol dream was dying first at its edges, that magnificent dream of one empire, ocean to ocean, governed by the great Yasa, sanctified by the eternal sky that had once blessed the destiny of Genghis Khan. But the greater catastrophe was not in the east, where Kublai and Kaidu bled each other's armies white. It was in the west, where Mongol blood stood in the shadow of Mongol blood upon ground still soaked with Baghdad's memory. In that same year of 1260 that witnessed the fraternal war igniting in the east, 2 Mongol commanders in the west shared the same ancestral bloodline and differed in everything else. One converted with a burning heart, the other still breathed the ash of Baghdad. Berke Khan, sovereign of the Golden Horde across the Caucasus and the vast Russian steppe, was not merely a Mongol prince who had adopted Islam as a political convenience, but a man whose convictions had become doctrine, weapon, and iron law. When the tidings of Baghdad's fall in 1258 reached Berke's ears, the Tigris running black with ink and red with blood, the house of wisdom consumed by flame, the caliph trampled beneath horses, his face became something altogether different. Berke turned his gaze southward toward the ash fields where Baghdad had stood, and spoke the words that historians preserved. Hulagu has sacked all the cities of the Muslims for the glory of the Christians. Had I known his intent, I would have acted accordingly. The terrible irony was undeniable. Berke and Hulagu shared the same blood, the same grandfather Genghis, the same ancestral doctrine of annihilation, yet faith had dissolved that shared inheritance as cleanly as iron dissolves in long fire. In 1262, war erupted between the Golden Horde and the Khanate across the Caucasus, a war that surprised history itself before it surprised its combatants, because no one had truly believed the day would arrive when Mongol would hunt Mongol with full intent. Savage engagements along the Ariq River in the shadow of the Caucasian peaks, steppe cavalry from both flanks colliding with identical Mongol tactics, and the spectacle was that of a mirror contemplating its own reflection with murderous grief. Hulagu recognized in Berke a doubly dangerous adversary, a Mongol commander who knew every secret of the Horde's military doctrine from within, and a Muslim whose soldiers carried into battle a conviction no iron sword alone could manufacture or supply. Berke, for his part, had already dispatched envoys to the Mamluk Sultan Qutuz, the common enemy of Hulagu, proposing coordination and alliance against their shared nemesis, because in the great theater of strategy, blood does not rise above necessity. That alliance between the Egyptian Mamluk and the Muslim Mongol was among the strangest coalitions in the annals of war, yet it was genuine, and its strategic weight was real. It kept Hulagu pinned on two fronts, bleeding northward while the Mamluks held him from the south. Hulagu was not decisively broken in those Caucasian engagements, but the war bled his Khanate into exhaustion and arrested its northern expansion permanently, demonstrating the eternal axiom that energy spent on internal conflict is energy denied to every external ambition. Hulagu died in 1265 at 51 years of age, leaving behind an Khanate lacerated from the west by Mamluk iron, from the north by Berke's cavalry, and fractured at its soul from the great imperial body that had given it birth and purpose. Möngke Khan himself followed into death in 1267, as though fate had determined that this war between sons of the same blood should conclude without a clean victor, that the wound torn in the Mongol spirit should remain permanently open and unhealed. But the deepest legacy of the war between Berke and Hulagu was not measured in casualties or in transferred territories. It was something more lethal. It shattered the mythology of Mongol unity, which had always been their most devastating psychological weapon. The peoples who had trembled at the mere utterance of the Mongol name witnessed for the first time a sight that dismantled terror: Mongol killing Mongol, horseman hunting horseman, the singular beast grown two heads consuming the same flesh in furious contest. This was the beginning of a profound psychological shift in the memory of nations, from "the Mongols cannot be broken" to "the Mongols break when they break each other." And that discovery carried a historical value no treasury of conquest could surpass. And in the midst of all this carnage, Mongol blood flowed upon ground it was never meant to consecrate, while Baybars, the Mamluk, stood in Cairo and watched the northeast horizon with cold and calculating patience, thinking, "Let them do our work for us."
The structural flaw at the empire's beating heart had existed from the very beginning. The greatest land empire in human history possessed no clear doctrine of succession. It lived and died on the raw physical dominance and magnetic will of the reigning Khan alone. The Great Yasa, the sacred Mongol law code, specified no fixed method of transferring supreme power, relying instead on the Kurultai to identify the most worthy among the ruling bloodline, a principle magnificent in verse and catastrophic in statecraft. For most worthy translated in the language of actual governance as most powerful, most allied, and most willing to strike first. And so every Khan's death became the lighting of a candle inside a chamber saturated from floor to ceiling with powder and iron dust. The great expansion itself bred its own particular venom, for an empire stretching from Beijing to Budapest could not be administered from a single center, and every prince who governed a distant province understood this reality long before any Khan's throne was willing to admit it. Each prince governing a remote dominion began by slow and imperceptible degrees to feel himself a king of a kingdom rather than a governor of a province, and to regard his local judgment as more deserving of respect than commands arriving from 1,000 leagues away. But the deepest and most lethal cause was one the Mongols had never anticipated. They had conquered peoples older than themselves in civilization, more deeply rooted in the earth, richer in the accumulated weight of language and faith and living memory. The Khanate in Iran and Iraq governed peoples who had inherited Persian Zoroastrian grandeur, Islamic Arab scholarship, and Greek philosophy refracted through Arabic translation. And with the slow inevitability of water finding its level, this spirit began inhabiting its Mongol masters. The scribes of the Ilkhanid court wrote in Persian, the viziers thought in the logic of Sassanid bureaucracy, the architecture of the new cities spoke in the language of Islam rather than the steppe, and each day the princes saw this and found it more pleasing than the last. The Golden Horde in Russia governed Slavic Christian peoples, borrowed progressively from their administrative structures, adopted local names in political marriages, and watched as bloodlines intertwined until the precise boundary between conqueror and subject became impossible to trace.
The Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia found itself compressed between two ancient civilizations, the Persian inheritance from the south and the Turkic world from the west, and was melted gradually into a new compound that retained nothing of pure Mongol identity but the name. And the supreme irony is that Kublai Khan himself, the victor of the Fraternal Succession War, was the most explicit embodiment of the Mongols swallowed by civilization, so thoroughly absorbed into Chinese culture that his own princes whispered he had become Chinese in everything but ancestry. Kublai built Khanbalik, the city the world would come to know as Beijing, made it his imperial capital, recast the empire's governance in Confucian Chinese frameworks, received Marco Polo with scholarly curiosity, and in doing so became a Chinese emperor wearing Mongol ancestry as a robe. While the pure-blooded Mongols of the steppe watched this with smoldering, narrowed eyes, witnessing their great Khan transformed into a figure who spoke the tongue of the yesterday they had burned, and who wore the silks of a comfort their ancestors had torn and scattered. This was the essential internal contradiction that consumed the empire from its marrow outward. Every Khan who succeeded at governing his territory became, by the very act of that success, less Mongol and more native, and everything governance gained, unity surrendered. Civilization does not take its revenge through swords. It takes revenge through culture, not through spears, but through poetry and music and the invisible architecture of faith. And the Mongols had been opening cities with fire, while those cities slowly, patiently opened them with flowers of slow surrender. In every Ilkhanid capital, the muezzin's voice rose to consecrate the dawn above the same minarets that Mongol commanders had once looked upon with contempt,
and in every Persian court the poet sang his praises to a lord who listened with a satisfaction no battlefield had ever provided. The unspoken lesson, the lesson that needed no chronicler to inscribe it, was this: whoever possesses the soul of a land will eventually possess the land itself, regardless of how many times the name above the throne is changed or shattered or rewritten in blood. And so the fate of the Mongol Empire resembled nothing so much as the fate of glaciers, not the sudden collapse of besieged fortresses, but the slow and patient dissolution of ice, drop by drop, year by year, generation by generation, until there was nothing left to mourn.
What remained of that magnificent dream? 4 fractured Khanates, each proclaiming itself the true heir of Genghis, yet together possessing none of what even one of them had once commanded. 4 scattered limbs from which no resurrection of the old body was possible. The Yuan Empire in China was the most outwardly brilliant, governed by Kublai with genuine administrative genius, yet simultaneously the most estranged from the Mongol essence it claimed to represent, a Chinese empire wearing a Mongol crown. The Ilkhanate in Iran and Iraq tightened and loosened its grip across alternating decades, fighting Mamluks to the west and Berke to the north, hemorrhaging strength in every direction until Genghis Khan arrived in 1295 to answer the empire's suspended question with his own conversion to Islam. Genghis Khan, grandson of the Hulagu who had incinerated Baghdad, declared his conversion not as mere political calculation, but with a depth his own deeds confirmed. He fought the Mamluks and lost and learned and built and patronized scholarship and made civilization where his grandfather had made only ash. The Golden Horde converted under the influence of Berke Khan and those who inherited his legacy, until Islam became the official creed of a Khanate that 1 generation earlier had besieged mosques and consigned sacred manuscripts to the fire. And the Chagatai Khanate, whose wars with Kublai had stretched across decades of mutual devastation, transformed itself slowly into a Turkic Islamic entity, until the Mongol name within it survived as nothing more than genealogical notation on parchment, the soul itself riding entirely different horses. The irony that scorches the intellect. The Mongols, who had shattered the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, became Islamic caliphs in their own new capitals, and from their descendants emerged the greatest patrons of Islamic art, science, and architectural glory that the medieval world had ever produced. History laughed in its low, private register. The civilization the Mongols had obliterated, they rebuilt more splendidly above its ruins, and their sons sat upon thrones, draped in the banners of the very faith their ancestors had ridden to extinguish forever.
The deeper reason for this transformation was simpler than anyone anticipated. The Mongols possessed a shamanic tradition that lacked the intellectual architecture required to compete with ancient civilizations of accumulated theological and philosophical depth. The cultural contest had been lost before it began. When a Mongol warlord sat in extended audience between a Persian philosopher, an Islamic theologian, and an Arab poet, time alone was sufficient to transform the warlord into something entirely other, something that woke to the muezzin's call rather than the thunder of massed hooves. But this dissolution of identity did not merely end the Mongol Empire. It also made Khanate reunification permanently impossible, for each Khanate now belonged to a different civilization, and their enemies had become, on occasion, their brothers in faith.
Enumerate the dimensions of the strategic catastrophe. An empire with no clear succession doctrine, stretched across multiple civilizations, dissolving it like slow acid, and perpetually at war with itself in fraternal conflict. This is not a list of causes of collapse, it is collapse's complete prescription. The lesson the Mongols might have learned had they been students of history rather than its instruments, that building an empire requires one military genius, while preserving it requires 100 administrative, social, and cultural geniuses that no man who trusts only the sword will ever possess. Genghis Khan himself, in his rare moments of hard-won wisdom, understood this. He said repeatedly, "Conquest is easy, governance is the impossible thing." But his sons and grandsons received those words as beautiful verse rather than the foundational doctrine of durable statehood. Across the 150 years that followed Möngke's death, the four Khanates corroded one by one. The Yuan Empire fell to Chinese peasant uprising in 1368, and the others followed it, each in their own appointed season of dissolution and shadow. Some fell not to any sword from without. They fell when there was no longer sufficient internal will to remain Mongol, as though the conquered peoples had said quietly to their conquerors, "You need not fight us, simply dwell among us long enough."
Military historians ask the same question each time they open the final chapter of the Mongol Empire. Was its collapse an inevitability written into its architecture from the first stone, or were there specific individual decisions that redirected the trajectory toward the abyss? The honest answer is that both are true. Structural flaws of genuine depth existed and cannot be denied. And there were decisive moments when princes chose pride over unity and the sword over the collective intelligence of shared governance. Every empire in history faces this same choice at some particular crossroads. Either build institutions greater than individuals or remain a hostage to the brilliant, singular man who, when he closes his eyes for the final time, closes simultaneously the eyes of the state itself. The Mongol Empire was always too vast to be a person and too undeveloped institutionally to be a civilization, suspended perpetually between the genius individual who had built it and the institutional framework it needed but never constructed beneath itself. Viewed from this precise angle, the Mongol defeat at Ain Jalut by Kutus and Baybars carries a meaning far deeper than a single battlefield reversal. It was the first visible signal of a machine whose internal mechanisms had begun, invisibly and fatally, to break. The Mamluks who stood against the horde at Ain Jalut knew something that most chroniclers missed. The enemy before them was not at the apex of its power, but carried within its chest the wound of dynastic conflict and the deep, unhealed scars of the war between brothers. This is why when professors of military science in war colleges across the modern world teach the fall of the Mongol Empire, they place internal disease at the summit of causation, above every external sword that ever pierced the body of that terrible nation.
The civilizations that redirected the Mongol trajectory did not accomplish this through force alone. Persia, conquered by iron, returned to conquer its conqueror through language and poetry and philosophy, and Islam, which had stood in apparent ruin, ended as the faith of the conqueror himself. This is the immortal lesson that strategists read in the closed chapter of the Mongol legacy. Military power governs geography, but cultural power governs time. And in every contest between the two, it is time that carries the field at last. The Mongol Empire was the most devastating military force that human civilization had ever produced, yet simultaneously among the weakest cultural identities that any ruling power has ever attempted to sustain across the breadth of a world it had conquered. The meaning, stated plainly, not every victor of the sword has truly triumphed, for there exist victories that are born inside defeat and flower from the ash, and those who lost the campaign of wars sometimes win the true and deeper war, the one measured not in seasons but in centuries. The Mamluk endurance was not merely the endurance of a state, it was the endurance of a civilization that refused to speak the word farewell, the endurance of a language that refused to fall silent, the endurance of a doctrine that understood meaning outlasts armies and outlives empires. And so the lesson completed itself in the great lecture hall of history. The Mongols arrived from the steppe with everything except the soul of civilization, and the moment they dwelt within civilization's shadow, that soul moved into them slowly, not purchased by the sword, but granted freely by the patient earth. Each of the four Khanates was, in its final reckoning, a great wave that hurled itself against the shoreline of human civilization and dissolved into mist upon the air, leaving behind in the sand not the marks of conquest and destruction, but the quieter, more enduring marks of absorption and transformation.
The old saying holds that time heals wounds, but time does something far deeper than healing. It adjudicates, deciding at last who was right, who built and who burned, who was the king of a single day, and who became the inheritance of ages. Look upon the map of the world today and ask yourself, where is the pure Mongol dominion? You will not find it in China, nor in Iran, nor across the Russian steppe, nor in Central Asia, but you will find the living marks of every civilization that swallowed the Mongol and endured. You find Islam speaking in the Persian of poetry, the Arabic of jurisprudence, and the Turkic of armies. You find mosques funded by the descendants of Hulagu, and treatises of science bearing the seals of Khanates that once fed those same manuscripts to open flame. This is the legacy of the episode we close today. An empire that devoured itself upon the swords of its own sons, yet from its scattered ash ignited the furnaces of later civilizations that could not have existed without the violence of that original cataclysmic collision. The observer who contemplates this complete picture arrives at a single understanding. Blood does not write civilization, and the sword does not define identity, and the mightiest empires in all of history have fallen only when they exhausted their strength in battle against their own reflection. The Mongol blood spilled across the wars of Kublai and Ariq Böke, of Berke and Hulagu, of Kaidu and the Great Khan, toppled not a single external fortress, but brought down the fortress of internal unity that had been the supreme weapon in Genghis Khan's entire arsenal. Let anyone who wishes to understand why great empires collapse read this chapter of history again and again. Nothing destroys a state as surely as an unresolved doctrine of succession, and nothing dissolves a nation as completely as overextension without a sufficiently deep and resilient identity to anchor it. In the next episode, the final chapter of our series, we witness history's greatest and most savage irony, how Islam conquered the conqueror,
how the defeated ultimately won the deepest war, and how the Mongols ended as the guardians of everything they had ridden to destroy.